had that incredibly disorienting feeling where you wake up, you look around, and you get this sinking suspicion that the fundamental rules of reality were somehow rewritten while you were asleep?
Oh, yeah. Like a profound cognitive dissonance.
Right. And not just political rules, I mean the actual bedrock. The rules of language, objective truth, basic mammalian biology.
Like missing a memo.
Exactly. It's that bizarre sensation of missing a memo that redefined gravity, right? And now you're walking down the street and everyone around you is just casually pretending that they can float.
And if you point out that, well, actually, we are all still on the ground.
You're the crazy one.
Yeah.
You are looked at as if you've completely lost your mind.
Right. And what you're describing, I mean, it isn't just a fleeting feeling anymore. It's become a structural reality for a lot of people right now.
Yeah.
It's the friction of seeing something with your own two eyes and then being explicitly commanded by the institutions around you to deny that it even exists.
And that feeling, that really specific tension between objective reality and institutional command, that is where we are dropping our anchor today.
We are definitely venturing into some intense territory.
Oh, fiercely debated territory. Look, if you've been following the cultural tectonic shifts over the last decade, you already know the ground is moving. So today we're doing a deep dive into a brand new, incredibly explosive ebook.
It's called Excommunicated by Feelings, How Cultural Marxism Replaced Biology with Resentment.
By Conrad Riker. And I want to give you the targeted framing right out of the gate here. This book isn't pretending to be some gentle, middle-of-the-road sociology paper.
Not at all.
No, it is explicitly written as a definitive manifesto for men's rights activists, for the red-pilled manosphere, and, really for any man who is trying to understand the historical architecture of Western institutions before they were, well, as the author argues, completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And this is where I think we really have to establish the parameters for how we're going to navigate this deep dive today.
Yes, please.
Because the material in this book is, by its very nature, highly politically charged. I mean, it is touching the third rail of almost every major culture war issue of our time.
Gender, race, family law,
corporate power dynamics, the foundational definitions of human biology, all of it. So our mission today is very specific. We are not here to take a side.
right?
We are not here to endorse Conrad Riker's viewpoints, nor are we here to condemn them or moralize about them. Our job is strictly to act as your impartial guides through the text.
We're just the map makers today.
Exactly. We're going to unpack his precise arguments, lay out the underlying philosophical frameworks he uses, and just give you, the listener, a clear, objective map of the ideas so you can see exactly what is being built here.
Trace the lines he's drawn and see where they lead. And I do want to pause right here and tell you, if you want to follow along with this map, to really see the raw data and the full arguments we're discussing, you really need to go buy this ebook.
Yeah, having the primary text is incredibly helpful.
It is. You can find Excommunicated by Feelings by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now. It is essential reading if you want to thoroughly understand this specific, rapidly growing cultural framework.
Absolutely.
And while you're at it, please like and subscribe to our show so we can keep mapping these things out for you. Oh, and go follow the author's ongoing cultural analysis at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
Because of the sheer density of the philosophical and historical concepts we are about to break down, Riker doesn't just start with modern complaints on social media.
No, he goes way
He
back.
builds from the ground up. To understand how an institution is actually captured, the text argues you can't just look at who won the last election.
You have to go deeper.
Way deeper, down to the foundational tools of human thought, which is why this whole manifesto basically begins with the dictionary, the first pillar of a classical education.
Grammar.
Grammar, exactly. And he uses a very specific catalyst to make his point, one that most of you listening will immediately recognize.
Oh, the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearing.
Yes, the April 2022 Supreme Court confirmation hearing. Specifically, that viral moment where she was asked to define the word woman, and she responded that she could not provide a definition because she is, quote, not a biologist.
Right. And a lot of pundits at the time just treated that as a political dodge, like a way to sidestep a culture war trap.
But Riker frames this entirely differently. He doesn't see a gaffe. He sees a terminal epistemological crisis among the ruling elite.
Which is a pretty heavy phrase, terminal epistemological crisis. Let's look at what that actually means in this context.
Well, epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? How we know what we know, the criteria for establishing truth.
Okay.
So when Riker points to a Supreme Court justice, someone whose entire societal function, their sole professional mandate, is to rely on the precise objective definition of words to interpret the law.
Right, they're literally interpreters of language.
Exactly. And when he highlights her inability to define the absolute biological baseline of human taxonomy, he is arguing that the system itself has become intellectually paralyzed.
Because, I mean, if you can't define reality, you can't legislate it.
Precisely. The argument here is that this paralysis isn't accidental at all. It is the necessary result of an ideology that actually requires the obscuring of the dictionary to survive.
Wow.
Riker posits that the modern institutional apparatus doesn't fight using scientific facts. Its primary weapon is the deliberate obfuscation of definitions.
So just making everything muddy.
Yeah, the logic is simple. If you destroy the definition of a word, you completely destroy the ability of the populace to point to or object to the physical reality that the word used to describe.
It's basically severing the tie between the map and the territory.
Exactly.
And he does this fascinating etymological breakdown to prove his point, going all the way back to the Latin roots of the words we use casually every day. Like, he specifically targets the modern conflation of gender and sex.
Which most of us grew up using completely interchangeably.
Right, but he pulls them apart.
He calls this an etymological exorcism. He points out that the word gender actually originates from the Latin genus, which simply means kind or sort.
Like a category.
Right. Historically, for centuries, it wasn't a biological term at all. It was strictly a linguistic tool used to classify nouns as masculine, feminine, or neuter in Romance languages.
Oh, right. Like a table in Spanish is la mesa, feminine.
Exactly. It doesn't mean the table has female biology, It's just a category of sorting.
But then you look at the word sex.
Yes. The word sex derives from the Latin secare, which translates to cut, to divide, or to bifurcate.
To cut, I mean, that is just visceral.
It leaves zero room for ambiguity.
Because it points directly to the inescapable binary, like the physical reality of biological dimorphism.
In mammalian reproduction, you are cut one way or you are cut the other.
There's no spectrum there.
No. Riker relies heavily on classical Aristotelian logic in this section, defining a thing by its genus and its differentia.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the genus, the broad category, is the physical reality of mammalian anatomy. Got it. The differentia, the specific defining trait, is whether that anatomy is structurally organized around the production of large, immobile gametes, which are ova, or small, mobile gametes, which are sperm.
Right.
He frames this as the unbreakable steel of biological taxonomy. Whatever cultural window dressing you put on top, you just cannot argue with the gametes.
But, I mean, the institutions he's critiquing actually do argue with it.
They do.
And Riker claims they do this by relying on a philosophical concept called nominalism. Let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly because this gets deep.
Go for it.
Nominalism, going back to the Middle Ages, is basically the idea that abstract concepts or universals don't actually exist in reality. So, like, there is no universal objective reality of a dog. There are just individual animals that we as a society have arbitrarily agreed to slap the label dog onto. Am I getting that right?
That's a very clean way to understand it, yeah. Nominalism argues that universals are just arbitrary names, nomina, assigned by us, not inherent truths discovered by us.
Okay, so how does that apply here?
Well, Riker argues that modern queer theory and institutional DEI frameworks have weaponized nominalism to completely detach human identity from the physical body.
I see.
If the category of woman is just an arbitrary name, a social construct divorced from gametes and chromosomes, then anyone can claim the name regardless of their physical reality.
And he calls this the performative gestural ontology, right?
Yes, it
Ontology being the nature of being. So basically meaning my reality isn't what my body is. My reality is what I perform or gesture toward, and the society around me is obligated to validate that performance as literal truth.
Exactly. But Riker argues the cost of adopting this nominalist framework isn't just a confusing debate on social media or, at a university seminar.
It has real-world consequences.
Right. When you divorce words from physical reality, he states it leads to literal blood-on-the-hands tragedy in the real world.
Yeah, and as an empirical anchor for this, he brings up the 1967 case of David Reimer and Dr. John Money. Now, given the target audience of this book, many of you listening might already be familiar with the broad strokes of this case, but Riker uses it as the foundational proof that this ideology is inherently destructive.
It is an incredibly dark piece of medical history.
It really is. For those who need a refresher, David Reimer was a twin boy, and as an infant, a botched circumcision essentially destroyed his penis. His parents were desperate, and they were referred to Dr. John Money at Johns Hopkins University.
And Money was one of the early prominent advocates of the theory that gender is purely a social construct, entirely malleable at birth.
Right, the nurture over nature idea.
Money saw this as the perfect, tragic opportunity to prove his theory. He actually convinced the parents to have David surgically altered, castrated, and raised entirely as a girl named Brenda,
Wow.
with the hypothesis being that nurture would completely override nature. If he was treated as a girl, he would be a girl.
And for years, Money published academic papers claiming the experiment was this massive triumph, basically seeding this idea of gender fluidity into the medical literature.
But the reality on the ground was horrific.
Complete nightmare.
The reality, which Riker meticulously highlights, was absolute psychological devastation. Despite the hormones and the social conditioning, David never felt like a girl.
He suffered immense psychological distress.
He rebelled against the dresses and the socialization, and he eventually discovered the truth of what had been done to him in his early teens.
And he immediately transitioned back to living as a male.
Yes. But tragically, the trauma was too profound, eventually leading him to take his own life as an adult.
Which Riker uses to state that modern gender theory isn't just logically flawed, it is structurally built upon the foundational sadistic abuse of a child to prop up a failed nominalist hypothesis.
It's a heavy accusation.
It is, but looking at this, it raises a massive logical paradox for me. I'm really trying to work this out.
What's the paradox?
Well, if the medical and academic establishments understand human biology well enough to perform a physical transition.
Right.
Like if they know exactly which hormones interact with which sex-based receptors, if they know the precise anatomy required for these complex surgeries, how can they simultaneously maintain the dogma that biological sex is an immutable reality?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Thinking about this, it's almost like a pilot. It's like a pilot explicitly denying that the laws of aerodynamics exist, claiming gravity is just a social construct, while they're sitting in the cockpit actively pulling levers and using the plane's flaps to land the jet.
That's a fascinating way to visualize it.
You are relying entirely on the very laws of physics you claim don't exist in order to manipulate the machine.
And Riker would agree entirely with that contradiction. He would argue that the institutional elite don't actually deny the biology in physical practice, they deny it in language as a mechanism of political and cultural power.
It's a deliberate equivocation.
Yes, they know the plane needs flaps, but they force the passengers to swear an oath that flaps are a myth.
Man.
And the book points out how this forced linguistic subversion ultimately ends up consuming the very movements that help legitimize it.
The revolution eating its own.
Always.
He uses the Michigan Women's Music Festival as the prime example of this.
Oh, yes. From 1976 all the way to 2015, radical second-wave feminists ran this massive festival with a very strict, uncompromising women-born women policy.
Right.
They wanted to create a separatist utopian space based entirely on shared biological reality and the unique experiences of female socialization.
Because they inherently understood that to have a cohesive, meaningful sisterhood, you needed an objective biological definition of what a sister actually is.
But because early academic feminism also helped popularize the idea of gender as a construct to fight traditional roles, it completely backfired on them.
Completely. As Riker outlines, they were eventually protested, aggressively boycotted, and essentially canceled into oblivion by the modern transgender movement for the crime of acknowledging the very basic biology their sanctuary was built upon.
The nominalist theory of gender fluidity that earlier iterations of their own movement introduced into the academic bloodstream mutated and ultimately destroyed their physical space.
So we see this deep linguistic and logical inconsistency. But the obvious question is, how does an ideology this contradictory manage to become the mainstream operating policy of major institutions?
Right. How did it win?
Yeah, it's not just on the fringes of Tumblr anymore. It's in corporate HR, it's in the military, it's in the courts. How did it capture the center?
To answer that, Riker transitions away from linguistics and moves into historical strategy. He argues that this decay of language didn't just happen in a vacuum, it was seeded.
Engineered.
He traces it directly to a strategic adaptation within Marxist theory.
And he highlights a very specific pivot point, which many of you listening are likely familiar with. The year 1934, when the Institute for Social Research, famously known as the Frankfurt School, relocated from a collapsing Weimar Germany to Columbia University in New York.
We're talking about heavy-hitting intellectual architects like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse.
As you probably already know, they fled Europe. But what Riker focuses on is the psychological realization they had when they arrived in America.
Right. They arrived expecting to find fertile ground for a classic Marxist revolution.
Which requires the working class to rise up.
Exactly. Classical Marxism, the economic model, requires the working class, the proletariat, to realize their oppression, rise up, overthrow capitalism, and violently seize the means of production.
But when these European intellectuals analyzed the American working class in the 1930s and 40s,
They realized the model was completely broken
why?
because the American worker had absolutely no interest in the communist uprising. The American proletariat was focused on buying a Ford, getting a mortgage, and improving their family's economic standing within the capitalist framework.
The upward mobility of the West was effectively a vaccine against economic Marxism.
So they realized the factory floor is a dead end. They can't incite the blue-collar workers.
So what's the pivot? How do they adapt the virus, so to speak?
Riker explains that this is the exact moment they pivoted from attempting to seize the means of production to seizing the means of definition. If you cannot control the factories and the capital, you must control the language, the culture, and the parameters of acceptable thought.
And to do that, they don't target the unions, they target the universities.
Yes.
And Riker is very specific about why. He argues they targeted the highly suggestible, perhaps overly theoretical minds of the academic elite.
Because a university is basically an incubation chamber.
Right. If you want to change a society without firing a single shot, you don't need an army. You just inject a new ideological framework into the minds of the 20-year-olds who will eventually become the next generation's teachers, journalists, lawyers, and HR directors.
You wait one generation, and your fringe theory becomes the unassailable cultural consensus.
And he pairs this tactical infiltration with two distinct concepts from other Marxist thinkers to explain how the trap was sprung.
The first is from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, the concept of cultural hegemony and the long march through the institutions.
Gramsci realized that true power isn't just held at the end of a police baton, it's held in the stories a culture tells itself.
Precisely. Hegemony is the complete, invisible saturation of an ideology across all cultural touchpoints until any alternative way of thinking becomes literally unimaginable to the average citizen.
It just becomes common sense.
And the long march through the institutions is the method. You slowly, patiently take over the schools, the media conglomerates, the entertainment industry, and the bureaucracies.
Because you don't need to win a political election if you write the dictionary and produce the cinema.
Exactly. The elections will naturally follow the cultural programming.
Which brings us to the second key concept, which I think is arguably the most recognizable in today's climate. Herbert Marcuse's 1965 essay, Repressive Tolerance. Riker treats this text as if it's the Rosetta Stone for understanding modern cancel culture.
Because it essentially is. Marcuse, writing in the 60s, argued for a very specific, highly paradoxical definition of tolerance.
How so?
He proposed that for a truly liberated society to exist, it must be infinitely tolerant of any revolutionary ideas coming from the political left or from supposedly marginalized groups, but it must be completely aggressively intolerant of any ideas coming from the political right or from traditional established institutions.
It's just institutionalized double standard.
Yes. Riker argues this essay is the exact philosophical blueprint for how modern institutions operate today. It provides the academic justification for labeling objective truth, classical debate, or traditional values as literal violence, while simultaneously elevating subjective feelings, protests, and manufactured grievances into unquestionable dogma that must be protected.
So if I'm taking these pieces, the Frankfurt School's pivot to culture, Gramsci's hegemony, and Marcuse's asymmetrical tolerance, Riker, synthesizes this into what he names the chthonic helix.
The chthonic helix.
I really want to spend some time here because this mechanism is the core engine of his argument. Chthonic, referring to the underworld, something dark, subterranean, destructive. And it's a helix, a downward spiral based on the Hegelian dialectic. Walk me through how this machine actually works.
Okay, to understand the inversion, we have to look at classical Hegelian philosophy. Hegel posited that human understanding moves forward through a dialectic. You have a thesis, an established idea, which inevitably clashes with its opposite, the antithesis.
Right.
The conflict between the two resolves into a synthesis, which is a higher, more evolved state of understanding.
But Riker argues the cultural Marxists hijacked this.
Hijacked it and inverted it into a downward destructive spiral. In his model, the thesis is biological reality, objective truth, and the traditional hierarchies of competence and merit.
Okay, so the thesis is basically the foundational rules that built the civilization. What is the antithesis?
The antithesis is a manufactured, weaponized grievance. It is the critical theory assumption that any disparity in outcome between groups is absolute proof of systemic oppression.
So, reality and competence meet manufactured grievance. What does the resulting synthesis look like? If I'm picturing this, if you combine a demand for excellence with a demand that all disparities are evil, the synthesis has to be a society where competence is actually viewed as a negative thing,
Right.
a flattening.
That is exactly his conclusion. The synthesis is a state-enforced delusion. It's a societal structure where the natural vertical hierarchy, where people rise based on merit, hard work, and objective capability, is dragged down and flattened into a horizontal matrix of resentment.
Wow.
In this synthesis, excellence is penalized and scrutinized as a form of unearned privilege. Simultaneously, the lowest common denominator of victimhood is elevated, celebrated, and given moral authority.
It's a system that actively punishes the strong in order to comfort the weak.
And it enforces this entirely by compelling everyone to participate in linguistic and biological lies. If you tell the truth, you are disrupting the synthesis.
That is a profoundly bleak theoretical framework.
It gets bleaker.
Yeah, because this is where the book shifts gears. Riker doesn't just leave this in the realm of academic theory or philosophical musings. He argues that philosophies eventually bleed into the real world.
Always.
And when this specific chthonic helix becomes the operating system of a society, it doesn't just change the culture, it has massive physical, existential consequences. He anchors this not in theory, but in stark demographic data.
He moves from the philosophical to the existential, and he does it rapidly. He argues that this ideology isn't just hurting people's feelings or making HR meetings unbearable. He claims it is mathematically ending civilizations.
And the primary data point he uses to illustrate the civilizational cliff is South Korea.
Right. Let's look at the numbers he cites. He notes that in 2023, South Korea's total fertility rate hit 0.72.
Now, just for baseline context for anyone listening, the replacement rate, the absolute minimum number of children a society needs to have just to keep its population stable, not even growing, just stable, is 2.1.
Yes.
So a 0.72, I mean, you can't even call that a decline. That is an absolute demographic freefall.
Riker uses that 0.72 as a terminal diagnosis, and he argues that this isn't an anomaly. It is the mathematically guaranteed destination of any modern secular society that fully adopts the cultural Marxist framework.
And what's his core premise there?
It's sociological and biological. When a society becomes completely gynocentric, meaning when it explicitly tells its women, through media and academia, that motherhood and family are an oppressive patriarchal trap designed to enslave them,
Right.
and simultaneously tells its men that their innate biological drive to be providers, protectors, and fathers is inherently toxic masculinity, the fundamental human mating ritual simply halts.
It's ideological castration. It's biological suicide by ideology.
Precisely. He states quite bluntly that if your societal theory requires the literal extinction of the human race to prove its moral purity, it is no longer a political movement. It has become a death cult.
And this ties into a really provocative economic and sociological concept he introduces, which he calls the surrogate state or the institutional husband.
Yeah, this is key.
He argues that despite all the rhetoric, feminism didn't actually dismantle the patriarchy at all. It just reassigned it to a bureaucracy. I want to unpack this. What does he mean by the state becoming the husband?
This is one of Riker's central arguments regarding modern institutional power. He posits that in the deep psychological architecture of human biology, there is an innate evolutionary drive for a protective, providing authority structure to ensure the survival of offspring.
Okay, that makes sense biologically.
Historically, on an individual level, that role was filled by the father, the husband, the patriarch. Riker argues that modern feminism and state welfare didn't abolish that deep-seated desire for a provider, they just transferred it.
They projected that psychological need onto the government.
Yes. The state becomes the ultimate, hyper-aggressive, bureaucratic provider.
And how does the state provide? I mean, it doesn't generate wealth.
No, it extracts it through taxation. Riker relies on economic data, asserting that men, as a demographic bloc, remain the primary net contributors to tax revenue and the maintainers of physical infrastructure.
So the surrogate state uses the implicit threat of force audits, police, imprisonment to extract resources from male productivity.
Exactly. Then uses those extracted resources to fund vast programs, subsidies, and an administrative bureaucracy that disproportionately benefits women and actively seeks to render the traditional nuclear family obsolete.
He goes really hard on the mechanics of family law to illustrate this extraction. he paints a very vivid, grim picture of the modern family court system.
It's pretty brutal.
He describes a scenario where a man can lose access to his children, lose his home in a divorce, and then face actual jail time because he cannot afford to pay alimony based on what the court calls imputed income.
Which, importantly, is not what the man actually makes.
Right. It's what a judge arbitrarily decrees he should be capable of making. Riker frames this not just as unfair, but as literal institutional enslavement to a system that explicitly hates the men it feeds off of.
He describes the modern man in this system as being forced to labor without ownership of his own body or the fruits of his mind.
Existing solely to serve as a revenue source for an institutional apparatus that views his very masculinity as problematic.
The man is stripped of the respect and authority of the father, but remains burdened with the financial extraction of a subjugated worker.
Okay, thinking about this. If we look at this strictly logically, almost like a biologist looking at an ecosystem, if it's purely extractive, it's essentially a parasitic relationship, right?
That's the analogy he uses.
The bureaucratic surrogate state is the parasite, and the productive male population is the host. But if the parasite keeps extracting resources and actively weakening the host, doesn't the parasite inherently starve itself to death eventually?
Naturally, yes.
If the host dies out, like the South Korea demographic cliff, where
Yeah.
the host just stops producing because the disincentives are too damn high, how does Riker account for this evolutionary dead end?
He accounts for it by agreeing with your premise completely. Riker argues that this system is an evolutionary dead end.
The chthonic helix acts as a civilizational contraceptive.
He predicts that the system will inevitably collapse under its own bureaucratic weight. You cannot fund a massive, non-producing grievance bureaucracy when the men who build the bridges, maintain the power grids, and generate the economic surplus simply decide to stop working as hard, or quiet quit, or walk away from the system entirely.
The parasite eventually kills the host, and then the parasite dies.
That is the 0.72 fertility rate in action.
So if the system is this hostile, this extractive, and ultimately doomed to collapse, the most pressing question becomes, why do men put up with it? Why do men willingly participate in their own extraction? How are they kept in line?
And this brings us to a fascinating psychological breakdown in the book, where Riker introduces the concept of the empathy cartel.
The empathy cartel. This section shifts from economics to the psychological warfare used to maintain compliance. Riker argues that the cultural Marxists successfully replaced objective, rigorous logic with hysterical emotionalism as the primary currency of power.
He starts by looking at the foundation of Western jurisprudence, citing Sir William Blackstone's famous 1765 ratio.
Oh, right. It is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. The presumption of innocence.
Exactly. It is the absolute bedrock of any fair, rational society. But Riker claims that the Me Too era and the modern empathy cartel intentionally and explicitly inverted Blackstone's ratio.
How so?
He argues the new operating principle of our institutions is that the emotional validation of the accuser is so paramount, so sacred, that we must automatically assume guilt, utterly destroying the presumption of innocence.
Wow.
He argues that any system that treats a mere accusation as irrefutable proof will inevitably and perhaps intentionally destroy the innocent along with the guilty, all under the guise of a weaponized, false empathy.
And he breaks down exactly how this trap is sprung on a psychological level, using a framework from 1956, Gregory Bateson's concept of the double bind. We need to spend some real time here, because this feels like the psychological linchpin of the whole book. What exactly is a double bind?
So Gregory Bateson was a brilliant anthropologist and systems theorist. In the 1950s, he was researching schizophrenia, and he defined the double bind as a communicative dilemma that is so structurally agonizing it can literally induce psychotic breaks.
Really?
Yeah, it's not just a difficult choice, it's a trap made of deeply conflicting commands where you cannot win. A true double bind has three specific components.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, there is the primary imperative, an explicit overt command that you are told you must obey. Second, the secondary injunction, a hidden, unspoken rule that violently punishes you for obeying the first command.
Oh, that's twisted.
And third, the metacommunicative lock demand, you are strictly forbidden from pointing out that the contradiction exists. You cannot step outside the frame to say, hey, this is a trap.
Okay, so how does Riker map Bateson's clinical double bind onto the everyday experience of the modern man?
Riker argues that modern men live in a state of perpetual, culturally enforced double bind. Let's look at the components. The primary imperative, what society explicitly and loudly demands of men constantly through media, movies, HR departments, and modern relationship advice, is that men must be emotionally vulnerable.
They must cry, share their deepest fears, dismantle their traditional stoicism.
Right. He points to the infamous 2019 Gillette ad, "Boys will be boys," as the ultimate corporate manifesto of this demand. Men are explicitly ordered to open up, be soft, and apologize for their natural aggression.
But it's a trap.
It's a devastating trap, because the moment a man actually complies with that primary imperative, the moment he cries in front of his partner or shows true, unvarnished vulnerability, the secondary injunction kicks in instantly.
The gynocentric matrix punishes him.
Yes. His vulnerability is recorded, cataloged, and eventually weaponized against him as proof that he is weak, unstable, or paradoxically inherently toxic.
He loses respect in the corporate boardroom, and he loses biological attraction in his romantic relationship.
Riker argues that women, biologically, are not wired to seek protection from a man who is crumbling emotionally.
And then the metacommunicative lock snaps shut. If a man dares to say, hey, wait a minute, society told me to open up, my wife told me to open up, and now you're using my vulnerability against me, he is instantly gaslit.
He's told he's just being defensive or fragile, or that he's doing vulnerability wrong. He cannot acknowledge the trap without springing it further.
Wow.
Precisely. Riker calls this an epistemic murder weapon. It is designed to drive a rational, logical mind into a state of permanent, unearned guilt and paralytic confusion.
You are damned if you remain stoic, because you are labeled as toxic and emotionally stunted. You are damned if you open up, because you are labeled as weak and pathetic.
Exactly.
So I have to push back here on Riker's behalf, or rather, I want to interrogate his conclusion. Is Riker saying that men should never show emotion? Is he advocating for men to be unfeeling, sociopathic robots who never connect with anyone? Or is he saying they just shouldn't show it to a system that fundamentally hates them?
It's absolutely the latter. Riker is not advocating for sociopathy or absolute emotional isolation. He's advocating for tactical self-preservation in a hostile environment.
Okay, that makes more sense.
He argues that a rational man should never offer his vulnerability to the empathy cartel, never to corporate HR, never to social media, and never to anyone who operates within this cultural Marxist framework, because they will inevitably use it as ammunition against him.
So what's his proposed solution?
Absolute, unyielding, stoic composure in the face of the mob. Silence is the ultimate defense against a double bind. You don't argue with the contradiction. You simply step outside the framework, maintain your frame, and refuse to play the game.
Refuse to play the game. But as Riker points out, the problem is that this psychological conditioning starts way before a man is old enough to even realize there's a game being played, let alone refuse to play it.
It starts in childhood.
Which leads us to his critique of the education system, what he terms the ontological gerrymander and the war on education.
Yes. Riker argues that the institutions of education have been entirely captured and repurposed. He refers to modern schooling as the pedagogy of emasculation.
He looks at primary education first, and he argues that normal, kinetic boy energy, the innate biological drive to wrestle, to run, to compete, to take risks, is no longer seen as a natural part of human development.
Instead, it is pathologized.
It's treated as a medical disorder that needs to be chemically suppressed so the classroom can remain quiet. He specifically references the massive overprescription of drugs like Ritalin to young boys.
And he brings up the highly publicized case of Josh Welch.
Oh, the 7-year-old boy in Maryland who was actually suspended from school for chewing a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun.
Riker uses that absurdity, suspending a child over a pastry, to highlight a deeply ingrained systemic reality. The modern feminized classroom, he argues, simply cannot handle the physical, chaotic, competitive reality of boy energy.
So instead of channeling that energy into constructive, character-building discipline and physical exertion like classical education did, the system drugs the boy to make him compliant, passive, and easy for female teachers to manage.
He claims this is the first skirmish in a lifelong war against the masculine spirit, sedating the boy into submission before he can even spell his own name.
And if that boy manages to survive that chemical suppression and makes it to higher education, the landscape waiting for him is even worse. We mentioned earlier that men now make up roughly 40% of college enrollment.
It's a massive, unprecedented decline in male higher education.
And yet, there's no national panic about this. There are no task forces trying to save the boys.
Quite the opposite, according to Riker. He says the gynocentric matrix actually celebrates this demographic decline as a victory for equity.
Right.
He points heavily to the weaponization of Title IX. Originally passed in 1972 with the stated goal of preventing sex-based discrimination in education, Riker argues it has been completely transformed.
So?
It is now used as an ideological cudgel to establish kangaroo courts on college campuses, systematically stripping male students of due process and transforming universities from places of rigorous, objective learning into indoctrination centers that actively celebrate male disappearance from the public square.
It's all part of what he calls the ontological gerrymander. Gerrymandering in politics is when you redraw voting districts to unfairly favor one party over another. Riker is arguing that these institutions are redrawing the boundaries of reality itself to favor the grievance mob.
And he takes this to its absolute logical extreme with what he calls medical absurdity.
Right. He points to the World Health Organization's 2023 decree that officially attempted to redefine gender globally, severing it completely from biological sex and declaring it a socially constructed spectrum.
Riker applies a classical logical tool here to dismantle this, reductio ad absurdum, reducing the opponent's argument to its most absurd, inevitable conclusion.
Let's play that out. If sex is purely a social construct, and there's no objective, fundamental biological difference between men and women, then medical science has to throw out everything it knows.
Yes.
If it's a construct, then prescribing different dosages of heart medication based on how a body processes it through sex hormones is bigotry. Suggesting a prostate screening for a biological male who identifies as a woman becomes a literal hate crime.
Riker argues that this isn't just silly wordplay on a college campus. It literally kills people. The ideology is so rigid and demanding that it would rather you die of a myocardial infarction on the ER floor because you got the wrong medication than risk offending someone's linguistic identity.
And this is where Riker introduces Thomistic philosophy to combat the nonsense. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century made a vital distinction between substance and accident.
Break that down.
Well, the substance of a thing is what it fundamentally is. It's immutable reality. For a human, the substance is their biological reality, XY or XX chromosomes, bone density, gamete production. The accidents are the non-essential traits layered on top, wearing a suit, having long hair, or societal expectations of behavior. Riker says the woke church intentionally and maliciously conflates the two.
So substance is the concrete foundation of the house, and accident is the color of the paint on the walls. Riker is saying they're trying to destroy the foundation by fiercely criticizing the paint.
Exactly. They critique the accidents of cultural gender norms and use that valid critique to try and eradicate the biological substance of sex. It is a massive, deliberate category error.
And as these boys grow into men, navigate this hostile educational minefield, and finally enter the workforce, they encounter what Riker views as the final boss of this whole apparatus.
The intersectional matrix is a corporate religion. Welcome to corporate DEI.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. To understand how we got here, Riker traces the lineage back to Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar who originally coined the term intersectionality in 1989.
Now, originally, this wasn't a worldview. It was a very narrow, procedural, legal framework. Crenshaw was observing how black women faced unique forms of discrimination in employment law that weren't adequately captured by looking at race or sex in isolation.
But it mutated. Riker argues it metastasized from a narrow legal observation into a full-blown cosmological point system.
Like a caste system.
Exactly. In a while today, the intersectional grievance matrix operates as a perfectly inverted hierarchy. A straight, white, able-bodied male is placed at the absolute bottom of this caste system, structurally stripped of all moral authority and presumed automatically guilty of systemic oppression by virtue of his existence.
Right.
Conversely, the more marginalized identities you can stack up, the higher you rise in this new hierarchy, until the most marginalized person is granted a status of near infallibility.
He argues this framework doesn't destroy oppressive power structures, it just flips them upside down and crowns the aggrieved as the new tyrants.
And the rhetorical trick holding all of this corporate religion together is what he calls the equity enthymeme.
Let me translate that because it's a clunky phrase. An enthymeme is a logical argument where one of the premises is intentionally kept hidden. It's like saying, it's raining so the ground must be wet, while hiding the assumption that we are standing outside.
Exactly.
He specifically calls out authors like Ibram X. Kendi here. What is the hidden premise of the entire modern equity movement?
Well, the stated conclusion that they preach is demographic disparities exist in the boardroom or in the courts. Therefore, systemic racism or sexism exists.
Okay.
The hidden premise, the part they never say out loud because it is so easily debunked by reality, is that all human groups are perfectly identical in all traits, cultures, median ages, and behaviors, and therefore any statistical disparity in outcome can only be the result of systemic bias or oppression.
But Riker uses the brilliant economist Thomas Sowell's data to forcefully challenge this hidden premise.
Yes. Sowell's data points out that massive, undeniable disparities exist everywhere in nature and society, even in places where discrimination is completely implausible.
Give us an example.
For example, firstborn children consistently have higher average IQs, achieve more professionally, and earn more money than their later-born siblings. Jewish Americans make up roughly 2.4% of the U.S. population, but hold 22% of American Nobel Prizes.
So Riker points out the logical flaw. If disparity automatically equals discrimination, then the universe is systemically discriminating against younger siblings and systemically discriminating in favor of the Jewish population.
The hidden premise is demonstrably statistically false. Outcomes are driven by infinitely complex variables of culture, geography, behavior, median age, and individual choices, not just systemic bias.
It really operates like a new secular religion, doesn't it? If we map it out the way Riker does, the corporate HR department is the new church.
Yep.
The DEI commissars are the high priests. Being born with a Y chromosome or white skin is original sin. And the only path to salvation is this performative, eternal self-flagellation, the apology tours, the struggle sessions, the endless implicit bias training.
But the cruel kicker of this religion is that you're never truly forgiven.
There is no grace.
The guilt is permanent because the system needs your perpetual guilt to justify extracting your capital.
That is exactly how Riker frames it. He calls it the indulgence trade updated for the laptop class. You pay the consulting firm, you recite the mantras in the seminar, but the doctrine strictly forbids a clean conscience.
Okay, so we have traversed a very dark, very comprehensive map today.
Yeah, we have. Riker has outlined a society that is linguistically subverted by nominalism, psychologically weaponized by double binds, institutionally captured by Marxist synthesis, and mathematically headed for demographic collapse.
The ultimate question for you, the listener, for the man reading this manifesto, is what on earth is a rational man supposed to do? How do you survive this?
And this brings us to the final strategic portion of the book, the trivium and the path of the uncancelable man.
Riker does not advocate for despair, and he doesn't advocate for violence. He advocates for tactical, intellectual warfare, and he returns to the classical trivium as the weapon of choice, grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Break those down for us tactically. How does a man actually wield the trivium in a modern, suffocating HR meeting?
Step one is grammar. You must relentlessly demand operational definitions. When a commissar uses a buzzword like toxicity, equity, or gender, you calmly stop the conversation and force them to define it empirically. Do not let them retreat into subjective feelings. Make them nail the jello to the wall.
Okay, and step two?
Step two is logic. You expose their category errors like conflating substance and accident, and you drag their hidden enthymemes into the light where they fall apart.
And step three is rhetoric. Once you have dismantled their language and their faulty logic, you deliver the undeniable, irrefutable truth with absolute, unapologetic conviction.
He gives this amazing, very specific example of what he calls the corporate mockery test. Picture this scenario. A guy is sitting in a fluorescent-lit corporate diversity seminar.
We've all been there.
Right. The HR rep is talking about unpacking the invisible knapsack of privilege. And the man raises his hand and says, completely calmly, if my privilege is invisible, how do you empirically measure it? Or is this just a modern version of witchcraft, where the accusation itself is the only evidence required?
It's a brilliant, real-world deployment of reductio ad absurdum.
And the crucial point Riker makes is that the goal isn't to convince the HR rep. She's a lost cause. She's paid to believe the doctrine.
Exactly. Riker explicitly states you will not change the commissar's mind. The goal is to freeze the room. It's to signal to the other rational men sitting there quietly, hiding behind their coffee cups out of fear, that resistance is possible.
It breaks the hegemony. It shatters the illusion that everyone agrees with the absurdity.
But he goes beyond just winning arguments in boardrooms. The ultimate macro solution Riker proposes is building what he calls the parallel polis, the parallel city. He says boycotts are too passive. You can't just stop buying a certain brand of beer or razor and expect civilization to heal.
A boycott is a defensive crouch. Riker demands an offensive posture. He argues that competent men must aggressively withdraw their expertise, their capital, and their labor from any corporation or institution that despises them.
He cites the aftermath of corporate misandry like Procter & Gamble taking an $8 billion write-down after alienating their male customer base as proof that the invisible hand of the market is still a powerful, punishing force.
But more than just withdrawing, men must build.
Build citadels, not bunkers.
Yes, a bunker is where you hide in fear while the world ends above you. A citadel is a fortified structure from which you project power. He wants men to build parallel institutions, new businesses, new media networks, new educational models, new financial structures, grounded entirely in logic, merit, and objective biological reality, completely detached from state subsidies and emotional blackmail.
Okay, I have to push back here because this sounds incredibly romantic and heroic on paper. The uncancelable man striding out to build a new world. But what about the reality on the ground? It is very easy for an author to say, walk away from the captured institution. Right. But what about the guy listening to this right now who relies on that corporate job to pay his mortgage, to feed his children, to keep the lights on? How does Riker address the short-term, very real, agonizing pain of this kind of total withdrawal? You can't feed your kids with classical logic.
It's a vital, practical question, and Riker doesn't sugarcoat it. He acknowledges that the road ahead requires immense sacrifice. But he counters that the pain of staying in a system that is actively plotting your obsolescence, extracting your wealth, and poisoning the minds of your children is far worse in the long run.
So it's about long-term survival.
He argues that psychological sovereignty is the absolute prerequisite for building anything of lasting value. If you continually bend the knee and lie about reality just to keep your job, you have already lost your agency. You are already a slave.
The parallel polis begins with the absolute, uncompromising refusal to apologize for your nature.
He believes that when a critical mass of highly competent men withdraws their labor, the vacuum they leave will rapidly accelerate the collapse of the corrupt institutions. And those men who withdrew will be the only ones capable of building the robust structures that replace them. It requires immense sacrifice, yes, but he views it as a biological and spiritual necessity for survival.
It's a call for a modern intellectual strike of the producers, like Atlas Shrugging, but applied to the culture war.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. To summarize the massive, exhaustive scope of this book, Conrad Riker's Excommunicated by Feelings asserts that human civilization fundamentally requires the hierarchical marriage of masculine, logos order, logic, building, boundary setting, and feminine eros.
He argues that abandoning this objective biological reality in favor of a cultural Marxist framework based entirely on resentment and fluid emotionalism mathematically guarantees societal and demographic collapse.
He provides his readers with the grammatical tools to see through the linguistic tricks, the historical context, to understand the century-long strategy, the psychological frameworks to escape the paralyzing traps of false empathy, and finally, a blueprint for men to reclaim their sovereignty by building parallel structures based on absolute truth.
It is a dense, provocative, and highly systematic argument.
And again, to you, our listeners, if this deep dive sparked your curiosity, if you want to see the raw data, the full syllogisms, and the complete practical breakdown we discussed today, you really need to go buy the book.
It's the only way to fully grasp it.
Get Excommunicated by Feelings by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now. And be sure to follow him at Conrad and Riker on Substack for his ongoing cultural analysis. Also, please like, subscribe, and leave a review for our show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the ideas shaping our world.
As we conclude, I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought that builds on Riker's premise, but steps slightly beyond the text itself.
Okay, let's hear it.
Riker aggressively advocates for a parallel polis built strictly on the rugged laws of rigid logic, merit, and biological determinism, completely stripped of the modern empathy cartel.
Right.
But if that citadel is successfully built entirely by these logical archetypes, what happens to the concept of individual free will? Can a human civilization truly survive on pure logos without the very empathy and emotionalism it is currently trying to escape? Or will the pendulum simply swing away from one extreme, only to lock us into a different, equally suffocating kind of rigidity, something to mull over as you navigate the architecture of our changing world?
A fascinating question to end on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.